So back to the question, is it just me or does everyone hate the arts right now? And I think, yeah, I think in general, a lot of people do not feel a lot of reverence for the arts. And that's because of a host of reasons, right? But one of the most important reasons is because of fascism. Is it just me or does everyone hate the arts? Hi everyone, welcome back to Black Wahala. This is episode 2 of I've Been Thinking, and today we're going to be talking about fascism and the devaluation of the arts. Granted, everything I'm going to talk about today is not new. None of the ideas I present are new. People have been writing about fascism for decades. People have dedicated their entire lives to writing about fascism. And of course, the current time we are in history is not new. I do think that what we are seeing today is fascism manifesting in different ways because our world has changed so much since the early 1900s. So before we address that question that I just posed, I thought it'd be very helpful for us to do a bit of a review of what even is fascism. In the 2004 book, The Anatomy of Fascism, the American political scientist and historian Robert Paxton defines fascism, saying that it is a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass based party of committed nationalists, militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandon democratic liberties, and pursue with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. Hearing that, I think it would come to most people's surprise that the actual word fascism originally had roots in leftist iconology. The word fascism has origins in the Italian fascio, which is a bundle or sheaf. The word recalls the Latin fasces and acts encased in a bundle of rods that was carried before the magistrates in Roman public processions to signify the authority and unity of the state. Before 1914, the symbol was usually appropriated by the left. Paxton states that Italian revolutionaries used the term fascio in the late 19th century to evoke the solidarity of committed militants. The peasants who rose against their landlords in Sicily in 1893 to 1894 called themselves the Fasci Siciliani. In late 1914, a group of left wing nationalists, soon joined by the social outcast, a one named Terrible Man, Benito Mussolini, sought to bring Italy into World War I on the Allied side. By the end of World War I, Benito Mussolini coined the term fascismo to describe the mood of the nationalist ex soldiers and pro war syndicalist revolutionaries that he was gathering around himself. And we know what happens after that.
I fasci di combattimento per il futuro, l'avanguardia, la rivoluzione. Oggi nasce il fascismo.
Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, and the rise of other nationalist governments in places such as Spain, Japan, Portugal, Croatia, and many more. Fascism was born in Milan on March 23rd, 1919. It was spearheaded by Mussolini, who claimed to declare war against socialism because it had opposed nationalism. Mussolini called his movement Fasci di Combattimento, which means fraternities of combat. Isn't that extremely fitting? From what I remember from my Romance Studies class on Italian history, Mussolini's creation of fascism was born really out of grifting. Like, he was a full time grifter. Mussolini had tried many things and had even presented himself as a socialist at one point. However, nothing had really stuck until he created his new movement, fascism. Under his fascist program, he called for fulfilling Italian expansionist goals in the Balkans and in the Mediterranean, and even in Africa, while also proposing women's suffrage, a vote at 18, an abolition of the upper house, an 8-hour workday, worker participation in the technical management of industry, the seizure of certain church properties, and more. Doesn't that sound kind of strange? Because there's some conservative policies, but there's also some pretty progressive policies. That is the conundrum of fascism. Mussolini's movement was about violent action, anti intellectualism, rejection of compromise, and contempt for established society. The majority of his base were demobilized war veterans, pro war syndicalists, and futurist intellectuals and aesthetes. These were people who were obsessed with speed and violence and denounced the past collected in museums and libraries. They hated centrists and often colluded with national conservatives against the internationalist left. They cursed cities and materialist secularism and praised agrarian utopias. They saw the provincial as being free from the conflict and immorality of urban life in the city. They used emotions and intense rhetoric, hoping to capitalize upon the ire and rage of the deprived body politic due to World War One. As Paxton observes, early fascist movements exploited the protests of the victims of rapid industrialization and globalization, modernization's losers, using, to be sure, the most modern styles and techniques of propaganda. At the same time, an astonishing amount of modernist intellectuals found fascism's combination of high tech look with attacks upon modern society, along with its scorn for conventional bourgeois taste, pleasing aesthetically and emotionally. Later in power, fascist regimes chose resolutely the path of industrial concentration and productivity, superhighways, and weaponry. Does that sound familiar? Hmm. Mussolini relied on romantic national memories of the past, a historic destiny of the nation state, and the domination of a master race. A fascist leader wanted to bring his people into a higher realm of politics that they would experience centrally. The warmth of belonging to a race now fully aware of its identity, historic destiny, and power. The excitement of participating in a vast collective enterprise, the gratification of submerging oneself in a wave of shared feelings and sacrificing one's petty concerns for the group's good, and the thrill of domination. And for many fascists of the time, the ultimate fascist aesthetic experience was war. 3 years later, Mussolini's party took power in Italy, and then 11 years later, another fascist party took power in Germany. Hitler's form of fascism would take on its own particular character due to its foundations in anti Semitism and have its own name and movement, Nazism. There would be other nationalist governments following, and it would all plunge the world into a violent war. Now, the question arises, are we currently living in fascist times? Some people say no, the times are different. The fears about techno authoritarians and far right populist governments are overblown. Most people are centrists, so the mass dissemination of far right ideology is not possible. We shouldn't draw parallels to the 1930s. What I would say in response to that is fascism has taken up a different look, but it still retains its character from yesteryears. Fascism, as we see it today, is an authoritarian dictatorship coming to power through a mass movement of sectors of the dispossessed. Fascism has grown out of the crises endemic of capitalism. So it's not simply just a tool of capitalism. Yes, fascists extend the capitalist order, but they are motivated by their own ends and desires. They wage war as an autonomous force for their own end. In a book that I've been reading currently that is very enlightening, it's called Three-Way Fight: Revolutionary Politics and Anti-Fascism. The authors say that fascism has an autonomous character that is connected to classes of people who feel alienated by the traditional institutions of repression. So, for example, the white working class, but it is also still connected to the needs of the capitalist class. So, for example, the tech billionaire losers of the world. It can be congruous at times and very incongruous at times as a revolutionary movement. Also, something I think people seem to forget is that fascism is not like a system alone, it's an ideology. It is a revolutionary ideology, right? Revolutionary does not necessarily mean like leftist, right? Revolutionary can also be something to dangerous and harmful ends, right? This also makes me think of, I took this class on Latin American revolutionaries, and I remember something someone had left as feedback for the class was that why were we only talking about leftist revolutionary movements when there were other forms of revolutionary movements that we could discuss? And I do think that oftentimes people think revolution, they're thinking progressive means, leftist means, you know, but fascism is also a revolutionary ideology. It's how they galvanize their base, and that's how it works. As the author stated in an interview, we live in a fundamentally hierarchical and oppressive society that is defined in large part by systems of power and exploitation and oppression. Then there are various kinds of political forces that grow out of that, including forces on the far right, fascist, and other kinds of far right forces. So there's definitively a relationship there between the far right and the oppressive order. But the ways that the far right has developed politically have often put in conflict with some of the groups and institutions that are in power. That's not just about rhetoric. There are genuine disagreements and conflicts between what far rightists often advocate and what is prevailing in terms of how society is organized. The Sojourner Truth organization suggests that the features that define the new situation of fascism include the sounds of the city. See, a fascist would hate that. A fascist would hate the sound of the city. It includes an economic crisis that is leading to the decay of certain areas of industrial activity, traditionally the center of capitalist strength, a social crisis that has led to a rapid decline in popular loyalty to traditional institutions without development of popular vision of the Revolutionary War out of the crisis. So think of MAGA people, think of QAnon, just think of I feel like the general feeling people have towards traditional institutions. People don't trust traditional institutions, people don't trust traditional media. The far right has created their own form of media, and that has further galvanized their base because they keep supporting the narrative that you cannot trust traditional media. Traditional media is biased. It's not objective. It's not telling the truth. And the Sojourner Truth organization talks about how the loss of US capitalism's overriding dominance within the world capitalist system is also a symbol and sign of this new form of fascism. We cannot ignore the fact that there are many people who feel dislocated and are seeking revenge against change. So in the past 20, 30 years, we've seen a great change in demographics, especially in the global north when it comes to migrants. And we see a great change in social mores, things that used to be considered deviant and taboo. I'm thinking of queer people specifically in the global north and the galvanization around queer rights. Those social mores have changed, and globalization has changed so much that people are feeling disempowered and dislocated because of all this rapid change. People want a strongman leader. They want their political father, their political daddy to come save them. Obviously, as we've seen in the United States, the strongman leader has no qualms with employing violence to impose order and obedience. See the arrest and deportation of pro Palestinian activists, migrants, and American permanent residents. He may not have a designated or official militia, but I don't think it would be superfluous to call MAGA a militia for Trump. Many leaders have identified scapegoats. Currently, migrants seem to be the scapegoat du jour in many countries such as Canada, the UK, the US, and more. Democratic institutions such as the courts have lost much of all their controlling and safeguarding power. So, who is saying that we still can't call this fascism? So, back to the question, is it just me or does everyone hate the arts right now? And I think, yeah, I think in general, a lot of people do not feel a lot of reverence for the arts. And that's because of a host of reasons, right? But one of the most important reasons is because of fascism. So before I begin further talking about this topic, I just want to note that I use the terms modern and contemporary art interchangeably because in popular lexicon, people use these terms interchangeably. I am aware that modern art references art created and produced from the 1860s to the 1970s, and that most people are referencing contemporary art when talking about art made after the 1970s. Also, just as a general note, I'm not a massive like hater of periodization, but I think that the lines that people kind of draw through periodization between these art periods can be blurry, hence why there's so much confusion, and hence why people often use modern instead of contemporary when talking about art that was made in 1996. Under Hitler's regime, artists who produced powerful work that challenged the notion of life and broke down barriers for the contemporary art of today were dismissed and ridiculed. For instance, the Nazis described the work of Paul Klee as insane, childish scrawling. Does that sort of idea sound any different than what you would hear from someone online talking about contemporary art these days? I feel like a lot of people are anti art, anti intellectualism, and anti abstraction. Art institutions and organizations are being defunded and just categorically destroyed, and art studios such as film studios are replacing artists with AI slop increasingly. Donald Trump named himself as chair of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C., and has canceled federal funding to museums such as Boston's Museum of African American History in order to combat what the Trump administration calls woke ideology and anti American propaganda. Since 2017, arts funding from the UK arts councils have been cut by 16% in real terms. Likewise, in Canada, government funding to the Canada Council for the Arts decreased by $3.63 million last year and will be reduced by $7.33 million this year. So, how do we get here? I want to say that people are so anti art, anti intellectualism, anti abstraction because they don't quite understand how to view the art. And I'm going to say that that probably plays an important part. But I also do think that there's much more going on besides people just not understanding how to view art that is abstract, art that requires just a little bit more intellectualizing, if you will. There isn't a singular source. Economics, education, social media, the loneliness epidemic, the pandemic, consumerism, and more all contribute to this. However, if we recognize that there has been a long forming movement towards conservative and fascist politics, we see that this should have been the expected outcome. Don't get me wrong, fascists enjoy art. However, they're only interested in art that romanticizes and exalts the nation state and the pastoral. They devalue the abstract, the different, and the ugly, and uplift the beautiful, realism, and sameness above all. Fascism's aesthetic theory is one that elevates the standard of beauty while also using a secondary aesthetic and purity in order to justify and project power. In 1933, leaders of Germany's Third Reich hosted two art exhibitions in Munich. One, the Great German Art Exhibition, featured art viewed by the regime as appropriate and aspirational for the ideal Aryan society. These were mainly images of blonde people in heroic poses and a pastoral Germany. The other exhibit displayed what the Nazis called degenerate art entartete Kunst. The works were abstract, profane, modernist, and created by enemies of the Reich. Jewish people, communists, or people who are suspected of being either of those things. They were displayed chaotically. There was graffiti on the walls that insulted the art and the artists and made claims that made the art seem outlandish and ridiculous. An entry in the exhibition handbook stated that in the paintings and drawings of this chamber of horrors, there is no telling what was in the sick brains of those who wielded the brush or the pencil. Sorry, wild. Okay. To them, the silly, the pointless, the ugly, the conceptual was offensive and defensive and not real art. Fascists are obsessed with quality and technique and abhor any art that they deem to be unskillful. Unfortunately, I feel like more and more this is an idea that many people also believe about contemporary art. I feel like the best example of this was the reaction to Thomas J. Price's 12-foot statue of an ordinary black woman in Times Square. Personally, I found that the art was it was what it was. Like I didn't think it was like world shifting, but I appreciate it for what it was. I wasn't quite sure what was so terrible or degenerate about Thomas J. Price's statue. Of course, conservatives were very angry about the statue. So that response was not surprising, but what was a bit surprising, which funnily enough, looking back, it's clear that this should have not surprised me at all. I was very shocked by the black audience's reaction. The statue was discussed with anger and disgust because this black woman was not a conventionally attractive black woman. Many black people suggested with so little words that the statue was a sign of degeneracy and that the artist himself was a degenerate because he had a sinister plan by creating this 12-foot bronze statue of a black woman engaged in quotidian life. Does that not sound very familiar? I'm laughing because even the idea of that is so funny to me. Like, but this is something people believe wholeheartedly. And again, it's not surprising. It shouldn't be shocking. We've had almost near a decade of conservative ideology being disseminated amongst Black people online, and you think of the various spheres of influence and how they routinely engage in conservative politics, fascist politics, and so it is no surprise that this was the response. Not only was all the discourse about that statue anti Black, it was also fascist. My favorite type of contemporary art is conceptual art. And this is mainly because it's more about the process and democratizing features of art in comparison to other kinds of art. But recently, I've learned that many people hate conceptual art and abstract art in general, to be honest. Think of the work of people like Marcel Duchamp, Kara Walker, Yoko Ono, Lorna Simpson, and more. A lot of people would argue that their art is not art in comparison to the works of Rembrandt or Monet or Cezanne. Most often, what I've heard is that people dislike this art for its lack of technical skill, and people hold an extreme distaste for the intellectualization and pretentiousness surrounding modern art. I wouldn't really take heart against this sort of argument if it was, a Susan Sontag sort of critique about the over intellectualizing of art that doesn't allow an audience and a viewer an opportunity to experience the art. But oftentimes, this is not what people are trying to get at when they are critiquing modern art. Art is subjective, and all art is communicating and expressing something. Even art you deem meaningless because it doesn't seem like it's communicating anything. You don't have to like contemporary art, but suggesting contemporary art is degenerate sounds like what? I'll give you a minute. While I do think people's distress about art that is focused on abstraction is unfortunate, while I do think people's distress about art that is focused on abstraction is unfortunate, and I'm definitely not calling you a fascist if you hate contemporary art, because of course, art is subjective. You don't have to like all contemporary art. I do think that there might be something to this connection of contempt for the modern and contemporary art and fascist ideology. Fascists need to dictate what art is because art has the power to create discourse, challenging fascist philosophy and propaganda. Of course, we've seen artists collude with fascists to create propaganda and even art for the fascist cause. However, much like during the 1930s and 1940s, many artists made it a point to create anti fascist art. And of course, I'm not only talking about like a distaste for like contemporary art, like visual art, but I think there's also a general distaste for anything such as literature, writing, and any sort of like humanities discipline. People really have a strong distaste for. And also, I find people have a strong distaste for social sciences. And I think a lot of this is also wrapped in this idea that like people do not like the fact that some people are experts in topics and feel like that is a form of elitism, and people view things like social sciences as opinions. They don't see it as a form of science. They don't see it as a form of work, like where people are being taught the theory, people are being taught the discipline, like they're being taught methods to do their work. People don't see it as that, right? A great example of this is the eugenics discourse. If you have been tapped in recently online, you have probably seen tons of videos of people getting annoyed, getting angry, and saying that people are changing the definition of eugenics because some people on TikTok are arguing that anyone who is suggesting that poor people cannot have children is engaging in eugenics discourse. And people are upset. They're like, how can you say that? Saying that people should have financial stability before having kids is not eugenics. However, if you're someone who's taken a bioethics class, you've taken a sociology class, you've taken a class on philosophy and the history of eugenics, I took a class on the history of eugenics, the idea of poor people not being allowed to have children because they're poor is like basic eugenics. It's like building block, like the simplest form of eugenics discourse that exists. But because people don't see the humanities, don't see the arts, don't see social sciences as topics that are worth learning about, and don't enjoy the fact that there are people who are experts, who have more expertise on a subject than they do, especially a subject that they don't think is worthwhile, a subject that they don't think that deserves study or deserves to be a discipline. They get very upset with you when you're like, actually, that is eugenics. Actually, that's anti intellectualism. Actually, that's fascist discourse. And it's like a basic building block of fascist discourse or a basic building block of eugenics discourse or whatever it is. People get really upset. And this is what I'm saying about the devaluing of the arts. But honestly, I could expand this to like a devaluing of social sciences, of anything that isn't squarely in the realm of technology and science. And even, I mean, even science is devalued, but not in the same way as the arts, the humanities, the social sciences. If you would like to learn more critical thought about this topic, I'd suggest you check out the book Image Control, Art, Fascism, and the Right to Resist by Patrick Nathan, Jacob's video Who's Afraid of Modern Art, Vandalism, Video Games, and Fascism, and Sean Greenier's video PragerU on modern art. Sean and Jacob have really good videos on fascism. They do a really good job of talking about this devaluation of arts and under fascist regimes and like the current, phenomena that we're seeing. Because it's not really a phenomena because, like I've already suggested, this is what the original fascists were doing in the 1930s. It's just I feel like this idea has become so entrenched and it's disseminated so much more that people aren't even questioning themselves when they start to call art, literature, film, visual media, anything that is not beautiful and aesthetically pleasing, or anything they don't quite understand immediately as degenerate art or bad art or not real art or trashy or whatever, I'm really interested in why people are not challenging themselves and asking themselves, why is that my immediate reaction? That being said, I'm not saying that modern art is accessible to all. It's not. I believe that it is this inaccessibility that motivates so many people to see modern art as elitist, pretentious, and snobbish. This is why art institutions, cultural workers, and art educators need to work to make sure that modern art is accessible to all. If people don't understand how to interpret and are not provided the knowledge on how to view it, then it is also no surprise that so many people turn against the arts, the humanities, social sciences. Paxton notes fascist movements could never grow without the help of ordinary people, even conventionally good people. Yes, fascists attain power through the acquiescence or even active assent of traditional elites, heads of state, party leaders, high government officials, many of whom who felt a very strong distaste for the fascist militants. There was wide complicity among members of the establishment, magistrates, police, army officers, businessmen, but there was also a widespread acquiescence by the average person, you and I. This makes me think of Hannah Arendt's The Banality of Evil. People think, how could this happen? How could this happen? How could this genocide happen? You know, how could Israel do what it's doing in Palestine? How could how could what is happening in Congo happen? How could what is happening in what happened or is happening, this is continuous, in Sudan happen? And it's not just like the officials doing the work, it is the average person giving assent to the state to commit these crimes of atrocity against other people that they see as undesirable and degenerate, and they see as vermin, as people that need to be destroyed. So I think one thing I will also say is that I think people should keep making the degenerate art, continue making the political art, keep talking about art, continue intellectualizing art, keep reading, keep writing, keep challenging your thoughts and ideas, and continue to challenge those around you. Acquiescing only supports fascism. Keeping ethical and principled, continue to make connections with others. Do not acquiesce. Remember, the fascists are afraid of difference. Do not let them convince you that there's something inherently wrong with difference. So, thank you for watching. I did want to do a brief check in to see how everyone has been doing. I've been very busy, I've been very stressed. This year has just been a very stressful year. I feel sometimes like I just need to sleep for like 200 days, 365 days, and like not talk to anyone. Is giving my year of rest and relaxation. I know, but I am tired. I am very tired. But this is just something that's been on my mind, and I just wanted to make a video about it and talk about it. Um, New videos will be coming. I don't quite know when, but they will be coming. I have ideas. I'm paying attention to what people are saying. I'm always, not to toot my own horn, but I'm always in tune. So I'm kidding, but I am paying attention. I have ideas. There's certain things I want to talk about some more on here. There's certain things I want to write about on my Substack. I've got 2 articles I'm working on right now, and maybe I'll turn one of them into a video. Who knows? But stay tuned. Um, Thanks for watching. To see more from me, you can hit the subscribe button and hit the bell icon so you get notified every time I post. You can also follow me on TikTok. On TikTok, I do more short form content. I sometimes post that on YouTube Shorts, but not as much. I feel like the context of short form content is different in TikTok. Like the landscape is so very different. It just works better for me on TikTok than on YouTube Shorts, but sometimes I'll post them. So if you want to hear more from me, but just like shorter content, follow me on TikTok. And of course, I have a Substack. You can subscribe to my Substack to read any articles that I release. Um, you can follow me on Instagram. I have an Instagram page. I'm gonna try and venture into posting on Instagram. I don't know how it's gonna go down. I hate that app. I really do. But otherwise, I'll see y'all in the next video. Sending lots of love. See you later. Bye.